Hey, what's up, guys? This is Mike, Parallax Monitor and ZR Control Guy. This is the tutorial series where I go through all the different features, functions, and design choices in the app and hopefully answer your burning questions about how everything works. Okay, so let's get into exposure tools. I think one of the things I want to say right off the bat is that really with everything in this live view, you can sort of click and hold and find different features and functions. And you know, um, that's just like a general sort of note for how the app works. So let's take a look at scopes. I'm a waveform guy personally, but obviously I have waveform monitor and histogram, and they're all scalable, right? But let's put on the waveform because that is my favorite scope. Um, Same thing with false color. We have a lot of different options. Xzone is the latest sort of stops based exposure system for false color. And as you can see on the right side, there's a legend, 0, +1, et cetera, et cetera. And let's also turn on our X lights and posts. Okay. So now we're really cooking. We got all the things on at once. But I don't mind showing it in this way because you can see how they're all sort of interrelated. Now you can see that I've got a pretty decent looking sort of finished exposure here. But are there issues with it? And obviously I'm on low ISO and I'm at 2000. I'm on a ZR. But a lot of these same rules will apply to any of the other Z series cameras. So yeah, you can see I've got my R3D LUT on, and it's just the standard LUT, and I've exposed and sort of set my white balance to something that kind of matches the lighting. So this image looks pretty well exposed to me. I think it's got a good amount of contrast, and generally nothing is really blown out on my face, which is the most crucial part of this image. We've probably got a little blowout here in the window in the background and stuff like that, but uh, generally we're going to expose for our main subject, right? Anyway, but are there any issues with this image? Well, let's take a closer look. So I'll pull up the waveform monitor, and I've built these guidelines in for R3D because if you look at a comparison between something like nlog on a waveform monitor versus R3D, there's a bit of a compression happening where the luma values and stuff sit in the R3D codec on a waveform monitor. So as you can see here, I've laid in the guidelines pretty well, and at the bottom, in theory, you could see clipping, right? So let's make that happen. Let's like clip the bottom. So we've started a clip, and you know what? The image looks okay here, but this is when you start to get into noise territory, right? Um, Shadow information is lost because it's clipped. And if we pull up our false color, you can see some of that happening here, right? The speakers in the background, this part here of my shirt where the shadow is from the light, and even on the side of my face and hair and stuff like that. When we're getting into this sort of dark blue, light blue, purple territory, that's really close to clipping. And then conversely, where you have that bright red there off to the right side of my head and yellow, we're also getting to some highlight clipping territory. And you know what? You can see that stuff on the waveform monitor, right? Let me just block that out, and then it pops back up. So generally, this is something that, I mean, if you care about noise, you're going to want to fix. And there are a lot of different schools of thought. One is commonly called expose to the right. So let's expose to the right. Let's make sure that we really don't have any kind of clipping in our and yeah, you can see there that even at the very bottom of the shadow areas of the waveform, there's not really any clipping. Now, there's some really dark parts of the image still, right? They've improved, but let's see what our image actually looks like. Yeah, so I mean, for my own personal taste, it's a little brighter than what I would like. And obviously, we're clipping some of that sunlight through the window. But generally, this is an image that is very safe. Let me just turn on false color. Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of sort of middle gray information, some stuff that's like a little bit lower than middle gray, and stuff that's like within two stops above middle gray. So you're well within recovery area to bring an exposure like this down. if you needed to. Let's go back to where we started, which is kind of the exposure that I like. I think that this is pretty close to a finished grade, and I don't personally care that much if there's like a little bit of noise in some of these shadow areas. You can see that most of my face is stopped, close to middle gray or a stop above. And there's some highlight areas and stuff on my forehead and cheeks that are, you know, slightly brighter, but I think that's a good balance of exposure. So those are scopes and false color. Obviously, there are a lot of different false color options. If you just wanted something that's kind of a quick heads up, you know, you can see again the shadow area on my shirt and the speakers and stuff is a little bit under. If we move over here, that's a little bit over, right? And everything else kind of falls closer to mid gray. So that's like a kind of quick heads up version if you didn't want to see the more complicated stop detail. So those are scopes and false color. And now let's look at X lights, right? And I think there's been some confusion in this area. So let's take a look at what it means. So as we look at our waveform monitor, what we're sort of analyzing here with the X lights is how much information is sitting above middle gray and how much information is sitting below middle gray. And if you look at the waveform monitor, there's a considerable amount of information, especially, as I move around the image, and you can actually see it change. But if I cover this dark area, now we're getting some more information here above middle gray. And if I move away from it, a little bit less, and maybe I move in front of this guy. So you can see the meters and the scope changing, but let's do something a bit more drastic. What if I really severely underexpose this, right? And you can see on the waveform monitor, a lot of information is sitting below middle gray. And you can also see on the traffic lights, the noise has gone up because the more information and the closer it gets to clipping the shadows, the more noise you're going to have in the image. So that's generally how that concept works. If I could blow this out, let me switch to something like high, right? Um, still, if you look at the waveform monitor, there's only one spot that's really truly clipping, one or two spots. And though this looks really overexposed, believe it or not, you can recover a lot of this image. And look at that. I mean, the noise is nothing, right? Like we're not even putting a toe into like the warning area of the shadow section. So here, the majority of information is sitting above middle gray. And if I were to make most of the image this blown out highlight here on my left, you're right, in the back window, then you'd see this clipping meter pen and you'd see the traffic lights pen. But since we only have a small sliver, the overall information in our scene is not clipping, right? Um, so yeah, believe it or not, you could actually recover an image like this pretty well. And since we're in the 6400 base ISO, the high ISO, even an image like this, if you truly wanted to get zero noise, this would be a good balance, right? You can look at the goalposts and see noise and clip and traffic light data, the scope data. It's really just a measurement of how much information is below or above middle gray. I probably went on way too long with all that, but that's how it works. Okay, let's go back to low ISO. Go back to 2000. Okay, so now we've taken a look at R3D in some detail. Let me just show you a sort of quick comparison of what the waveform looks like that's different with NLOG, NRAW sort of codecs. So we'll switch to NRAW, and we'll switch our LUT, obviously, to an NLOG LUT. And yeah, I mean, you can see a sort of similar pattern. The big difference here is that NLOG is actually going to clip at the top of the waveform monitor, right? It'll go all the way to the top of the waveform monitor. And let's get it to clip the other way in the shadow direction. Let's go really far. Yeah, let's go to like 500. So you can see an obvious like sort of bottom there as well on NLOG. And I'll likely draw in that bottom line, but it's the same across the entire NLOG spectrum. Unlike R3D, where that stuff changes, like the highlight top and the mid gray point and the shadow clipping have a little bit of variance. although the shadow clipping doesn't have much variance on the R3D side, but the mid-gray point and the highlight point have a lot of variance. That doesn't really exist in the N-log space. The top is the top and the bottom is the bottom, no matter what ISO you choose. So yeah, I mean, you can see that we can get a very similar image. It doesn't have quite the same color, but we're using our standard N-log LUT and using a similar ISO value, and it's actually pretty close. We turn on our false color, we can see maybe a little bit more noise. Maybe we could pump this up a hair. So let's go 3200. Yeah, now we're getting a more similar sort of exposure. Maybe that's a little too far. 2500. That's close. Yeah, 2500 is pretty close to what we were getting on the R3D side. Although I will say R3D just seems to have a little bit better handling of the range, in my opinion. So let's see what our exposure looks like now. Yeah, pretty comparable, pretty similar image. Let's go back to R3D and let's switch our LUT, medium. There we go. Yeah. So yeah, as you can see, there are some similarities generally around the same ISO for exposure between the two different codecs. Um, Obviously, you'll want to play and test this stuff and test in your environment, test in your scenes. Every scene is going to have different dynamic range depending if you're outside or inside and naturally lit or artificially lit, with studio lights and stuff like I am now. It depends on how much control you have, and some scenes are going to have more dynamic range, so you'll have to make trade-offs, right? Like sometimes a large portion of your image will be somewhere between like an extreme shadow and an extreme highlight position. And I think the big key there is, look at something like this and try and find a good balance. Like get as close to the middle as you can, and you'll have to make concessions where you can. You can't keep all your shadow information perfect and all your highlight information perfect. There's always some concessions in uncontrolled environments. So your mileage may vary, as they say. Okay, well, that's some of the basics of the exposure tools. I hope that helps in a general sense. There'll be more tutorials and guides that I'm going to work on. So yeah, I guess we'll stop there for this. Thanks. Any questions you have, please put it in the comments below, and I'm happy to answer them. Bye for now.